Welcome everyone to this research seminar where we have the pleasure to have Lena Wängnerud as our guest. She's a professor of political science at Gothenburg University since 2010 or something, I think. She will talk about why women's political representation affect levels of corruption today. She received her PhD in political science from Gothenburg in 1998 with a dissertation on women's representation in the Swedish parliament. Her work engages with topics such as corruption, representative democracy, and a focus on gender and gender equality. So examples of publication include articles such as Will Women Representation Reduce Bribery? Corruption as an Obstacle to Women's Political Representation, and Women in Parliaments, Descriptive and Substantive Representation. So I see representation as a recurring theme in your work.
Yes, very much true. No, thank you very much for inviting me. So the title of the talk you have already heard, so I will not repeat it again. And the most of my talk will be based on already published papers that I have co-authored with Monica Bauer and Nicolas Cheron, also at the Department of Political Science in Gothenburg. And it has been published in Political Behavior, European Journal of Political Research, and European Political Science Review. But towards the end of the talk, I will focus a bit on ongoing research that is not yet finished, but also on the theme women's political representation and corruption. And the project that I have together with Monica and Nicolas has been funded by the Swedish Research Council. And the aim of the project has been to investigate how and why women in elected office is associated with lower levels of corruption. And we have been using many different methods from regional level surveys, survey experiments, and local data over time. And most of our research is at the subnational level in EU member states. But I was informed that this is a multidisciplinary research institute, so therefore I would not like to assume that everyone knows what is corruption and what kind of definition is it that we are using, and also why is this important to focus on at all. So what is corruption? Well, if you look at research, you will find a number of different definitions. But the World Bank used this definition: the abuse of public office for private gain. It covers a wide range of behavior, from bribery to theft of public funds. Transparency International, one of the most well-renowned organizations, international organization in this area, uses a slightly different definition: the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. But what we are focusing on is always interaction with the public sphere, with politicians or civil servants. So this is very important. And I think that the most important distinction to make is between petty corruption and grand corruption. Petty corruption is typically bribes in healthcare, in the school system, etc. And this involves typically rather small sums. And mostly this is about speeding up processes in getting a certificate, or sometimes about getting a grade or receiving an interest to education and so on. And grand corruption is taking place at the elite level of society, and here it involves large scam, and it's on the, societal, the large level of society, so to speak. And here it could be about getting a contract, a private firm, or trying to influence public policy in certain ways. And when we talk about private gain, it does not have to be one person. It could be also for a political party. But it's always about some kind of interaction with either politicians or civil servants in the kind of work that we are doing. So why care about corruption? This figure I have from my colleagues Natalia Alvadoro, Søren Holmberg, and Bo Rothstein, and it's what they call the Good Society Index versus Corruption Perception Index from Transparency International. And higher figures here mean a better situation, a better society and also better control of corruption or less corruption. And up here you find a lot of Northern European countries like Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark as expected. And down here is a lot of African countries, but also like Afghanistan, Central African Republic. And this has been the constant picture for more than 3 decades, I would say, if you do this kind of correlation. And the good society, it measures infant mortality, life expectancy, and also subjective well-being. And well, a good society is hard to reach with high levels of corruption. There's a negative impact on people's willingness to pay taxes, as Stefan Salfors here has shown in the publication. Basically, it's about the leakage of public resources that undermines the possibility to build welfare or good societies in the long run. So therefore, we should care about corruption. But why then care about corruption in the EU? As you could see on the previous slide, a lot of European countries are doing quite well from an international perspective. Well, the EU itself has estimated that the corruption is up to 6% of its GDP. A very large number of European citizens believe that corruption is widespread in their own countries and that affects legitimacy for public institutions. And also, of course, this is a problem for businesses trying to do business. But it's also, I think that one way to think about this is that, as I will show in the next slide, we should care about corruption in the EU because here it's actually possible to have an influence and reduce levels of corruption. When the levels of corruption are really, really high, it's very hard to start any processes towards a lower corrupt society. But one way for us as scholars to focus on EU is actually to increase the knowledge on how to reduce levels of corruption, how to try to combat these detrimental aspects of public administration and public, the public administration at large in countries. And why then care about gender in this larger picture? Well, in early 2000s, researchers at the World Bank started to show this picture, that there is a correlation between high numbers of women in national parliaments and better control of corruptions. So also here means higher numbers means a better situation. Higher number of women in the national parliament and better control of corruption. Here's a measure from the World Bank. And the other slide shows that this correlation is actually stronger in European countries. And as I said before, when corruption levels are really, really high, we do not expect that the number of women elected should have an impact. But when societies are a bit more well-functioning, we can see that there is a correlation between the number of women elected and levels of corruption. The higher the number of women, lower level of corruption. And this pattern is repeated. It does not really matter which kind of measure we use of corruption, because this picture comes up over and over again. And I would not say that there is very much research in this area, but quite a lot of research, and it's growing research field. And the explanations brought up for this correlation, if I look at it from a more overarching picture, I would say that there are 3 big explanations that are repeated over and over again in this research area. First, there is research showing, well, what we see is the reverse causality, that corruption actually is an obstacle for women. So women do not get elected when corruption levels are high. But I will not focus on that part now. I will focus on the other side. Why is it that the election of women reduces levels of corruption. Some scholars talk about risk aversion. Women in politics are punished harder than men for wrongdoing, and therefore they would refrain from corruption. Because if they are involved in corrupt interaction and there's a corruption scandal, well, then the risk is higher for women for not being re-elected in that kind of situation. And there's also one type of explanation focusing on women as outsiders. Well, women might get elected to parliaments, but they do not reach the higher levels within political parties. They remain outsiders even though they are elected. And this means that they are excluded from the kind of networks where corruption normally takes place. But what we focus on in our research project is what we call issue area specialization. The female politicians, more than the male colleagues, push for public service delivery in areas such as healthcare and education. And why should that be the case? Well, women citizens and also women as politicians have a special interest in a well-functioning state that can deliver public goods in areas affecting women citizens the most. And this is because we know that women still have greater caretaking responsibility in everyday life. I would not say that these are competing perspectives. I think that they are complementary. But in our study, we focus on this issue area specialization because there is less knowledge in this area. And therefore, we wanted to test and see, is this a credible perspective? With what kind of empirical data can we say whether this is true or not? Because it's still a suggestion rather than a finding. And now I'm going to talk on the publication in the European Journal of Political Research. And here we focus on petty corruption, which is about bribes and also informal gifts. It does not always have to be about money. It can also be about an interaction including informal gifts. And here we base our results on a survey done from the Quality of Government Institute at the University of Gothenburg. And this study was done to 85,000 randomly selected European respondents in 21 countries in 2013. And in this survey, people are asked, have you been in contact with the civil servants the past 12 months? And if yes, did you then have to pay a bribe or give an informal gift in order to get the service that you are entitled to? And we correlate this measure on petty corruption with data on women's representation in local councils. And this is done on the regional level in EU member states. So for the local councils, it's an average within a region. And that is quite important to understand. And here I will only show the main result. The main results, if you are interested in the details, you have to go to the publication itself. And I will start by presenting the main finding. And what we see is that when the level of women's representation is really low, and here I'm talking about around 10%, there is great variation in the percentage of citizens that pay a bribe or give informal gifts. It goes from around 0 up to 33% of respondents saying that they have paid a bribe or given an informal gift. But when the number of women is high, and here when it exceeds 30% in local councils, it's always the case that the level of corruption is low. There is no region with more than 8% of respondents saying that they have been paying a bribe or given an informal gift. So, one main conclusion here is when the proportion of women in local council is high, corruption is always low in this data. And here is the empirics. On the x-axis, we can see the share of women in municipal councils, and the bars show the distribution. So on average, it's around 25% women in local councils, one can say. But there's a few places where the number is above 40%. And here you can see the estimation of corruption experience in percentages. And the main result here is that, as I told you, when the proportion of women is low, corruption tends to be more common. And when the number of women increases, levels of corruption decreases. And especially among female respondents, which is the black line here. So when the number of women in local councils increases, it's particularly among female citizens that corruption goes down. And in this data, we ask about bribe paying in different sectors of society: educational sector, healthcare, and law enforcement. And law enforcement here is police authorities. And here, which we find very interesting, is that it goes down in the sectors of education and healthcare, but not in law enforcement. And especially among female citizens in those areas. And we know that women in European countries are in a lot of contact with civil servants within education, within the healthcare, because they have greater caretaking responsibilities in everyday life. So it's especially in those areas affecting women citizens the most, and where we can expect women to have a lot of contact with civil servants, that we see a decrease in levels of corruption when the number of women in local councils goes up. And the final result from this publication is that we try not only to look at Peter corruption, but also on ground corruption. And this is data that we have not collected ourselves, and it's mainly about corruption risk in procurement processes. And the measure here includes things like the length of the bidding process. Is it very short bidding process, less than a week, or is it a long bidding process? And how many bids did the public administration receive? Is it only one bid, a short bidding process? Well, then the corruption risk is higher as compared to when there's a long bidding process and there are many bids within the procurement process. And the result here is just to show that, well, we get the same picture. The higher the number of women in local councils, the lower the level of corruption, also when we include a measure on ground corruption. Okay, but this, as I said, is a kind of snapshot picture, where data is from 2013. But the surveys from the COG Institute have been done in several different waves. And in this study in political behavior, we use data from 2010, 2013, 17, and 2021 in order to see changes over time, have a more dynamic perspective rather than a snapshot picture. And the map here shows the average level of bribe paying for all these waves merge, and the darker the picture, the more corruption is taking place. And typically Italy, a lot of corruption, but also variation within the country. Poland, also high levels of corruption, but also variation. So the main message here is, well, there is variation in levels of corruption at the region level in the EU. And here we have the proportion of women not in local councils, but in regional parliaments. So this time we have data on corruption on the regional level, and also data of the number of women elected in regional parliaments. And also, as you can see, there is great variation from parliaments with 0 number of women up to parliaments with more than 60% women elected. And this is just to show you that we get the same trend when we use this kind of data. So this is all waves collected. And also here we can see that the level of corruption goes down, both among women and men, but the reduction is stronger among female citizens. But what is most interesting with this data is that we are able to compare the different waves. So if we compare levels of corruption in 2010 with 2013, and then we compare 2013 with 2017, and then 2017 with 2021, what kind of pattern can we see? And then we look what happens between those waves with the number of women elected to the regional parliaments. Is it decreasing? Is it increasing? Or does it remain stable? So I will not get in too much of the details here, but we are able to do this in 128 regions in 10 countries that have been included in all waves. And what we can see here, so the dashed line represents regions where there is an increase in the proportion of women elected between the 2 points of measure of corruption. And between 2010 and 2013, we can see that there is a decrease in levels of corruption when there is an increase in the number of women elected. When the number of women elected is stable or actually decreases, there is a slight increase in levels of corruption. And when we compare 2013 and 2017, there is a small increase in levels of corruption in regions, but when there is an increase in the number of women elected, the increase of level of corruption is much smaller, basically remains quite stable. And then 2017 to 2021, there's a decrease in levels of corruption, and here the pandemic comes in, because then a lot of Europe closed down, so levels of corruption also decreased. And the decrease is more pronounced when there is an increase in the number of women elected. So this, I think, is more gets more credibility to our argument. There's actually something happening when the number of women increases. It has an impact on levels of corruption. And we can actually in this data see that the strongest effect is when there is a quite large increase in the number of women elected. If it goes up with around 5 percentage points or more, then we can see this, that the effect is the largest.
Could you just say what are the tails? Are they confidence intervals or?
The intervals.
Yeah, the tails from the.
Well,
this
is from around 4 percentage points up to 7 percentage points of people paying a bribe.
No, but I was relating to the tails of the estimates. What do they indicate?
Well, whether the difference is significant or not. Yeah.
Okay.
But what is most interesting is if the change is significant or not. That's the most interesting part. And then finally, before I get into a summary and say, so why do we think that we see these findings? Because so far I have mostly told you about the empirics, what is it that we see, and not so much about why do we see this pattern. And here in the publication from the European Political Science Review, we do an experiment among citizens, and how they perceive female and male candidates as cleaners. And the title of the publication is Gender Corruption and Voter Stereotype. So we investigate if women by citizens are seen as more effective at reducing societal level of corruption, and if this holds across different contexts. So we investigate female politicians as cleaners when the corruption scandal has taken place. And this can of course be about stereotypes, but it can also be about personal experiences, and we cannot disentangle whether it's about stereotypes or some kind of true experience. So this is also collected through the surveys to to citizens in EU member states, and this data come from 2021. And this is what the experiment looked like. We ask, well, finally, let's say that two politicians in a city or town similar to yours is running for city mayor or the equivalent. And there have been several recent corruption scandals. The election is close, and these are the only candidates with a chance to take office. Based on what you see below, which of these candidates do you believe would be best to reduce municipal level corruption? So the scenario is that the corruption scandal has been taking place, and then we ask respondents to evaluate the future. Who will be best at reducing levels of corruption? And then we randomly describe or we vary gender and age, party label, political background, whether the person is an outsider or well-connected politician, but also which kind of election issue that they are mainly running on. Healthcare, education, infrastructure, economic development. But also personality type, whether the politician is cautious and careful or willing to take risks. So this is a kind of experiment that the respondents are facing. And what is most expected is, of course, that respondents prefer a politician from the same party as they favor themselves. And this has been the finding in so many experiments in this area. So we did not expect anything else. So partisanship is what affects the judgments of respondents the most. But we also see an effect of gender. And on average, respondents prefer a female candidate over a male candidate when everything else is held constant. So there is a preference for female candidates among citizens in the EU, at least when the scenario is embedded in a corruption setting. And here we disentangle between male and female candidates, and the red circles is just to show that the respondents prefer a female candidate portrayed as cautious, but also a female candidate running on healthcare. The least preferred candidate is a male candidate running on infrastructure. That kind of candidate is not believed to be able to reduce levels of corruption. And we can also see that both male and female respondents prefer a female candidate. That's up there. But we can also see, which is kind of interesting, that female citizens, respondents, tend to punish the male candidate to quite a large extent. So both the female and male respondents prefer a female candidate, and male respondents are quite happy with the male candidate, but female respondents are not. So they are to a larger extent punishing the male candidate. So women mayors are seen as more likely to reduce corruption compared to male mayor, and this holds is in around 60% of the cases that we do this experiment in. And it's in particular women voters see women mayors as cleaners. But we can also see that male candidates benefit from being depicted as risk-averse or focusing on welfare issues. And therefore we think that this is perhaps about anti-corruption stereotypes more than gender stereotypes, actually. But summing up, and here I use perhaps a risky picture, but we see that there is a strong evidence, often association between proportions of women elected and levels of corruption at the subnational in the EU. And I don't think that anyone is questioning that kind of result, because it shows up regardless of what kind of measure of corruption that we use. So this is a kind of stable picture. So the question is rather, why do we see this picture? And we can see that there are visible expectations of female politicians to deliver in areas affecting female citizens or voters the most. And we think, even though we cannot measure the exact mechanism at work, that our data point to women's interest mechanism, that female politicians are prioritizing a state on track that can deliver healthcare, can deliver in healthcare and education. And this can be out of pure strategic reason, that they want to be re-elected, and they can see that they can use this in election campaigns, but it also can be based on ideological motives, that you as a politician actually want to change something in the area where you live, and therefore push harder for public service delivery in those areas affecting especially female citizens. And it's not politicians themselves that are delivering the public services. It's civil servants, it's teachers, it's nurses, it's doctors that are actually delivering what we are measuring. And what we are measuring is the contact between citizens and those civil servants, not the contact between citizens and the politicians themselves. And as I say, we cannot, or we have not so far been able to measure the exact mechanism. But what we suggest in our studies is a signaling mechanism, that civil servants adapt to expectations attached to women in politics. That there is an expectation of women behaving better, not accepting misconduct, and that civil servants adjust to these expectations. Because this is kind of mechanism that the studies outside the area of gender studies has found, that civil servants, they tend to adapt to the parties in leadership, regardless of whether they themselves belong to the party in power or not. So we actually base this suggestion on other studies finding these kind of signaling mechanisms. And what I want to show here is that, well, the sending cell is the proportion of women elected, and the signal does not reach all sectors of society. The signal reaches especially those areas affecting women in society the largest. So it's not the case that a higher number of women elected means lower levels of corruption in all sectors of society. We could see that it did not have an effect on law enforcement, on police authorities, but in contact with education and the health sector. So this is what we propose as the mechanism at work, because we cannot see evidence of female politicians, building audit systems in another ways than male politicians. So it's not a kind of, formal way of reducing corruption levels. We think it's more about this kind of signals that goes out through the public administration when the number of women elected increases. And we also think that the signal is stronger when there is a large increase in the number of women elected, because we could see that in our study on dynamic changes over time. Okay, a few words then on ongoing research, which is not finished yet, but I'm working on. Because sometimes corruption is presented as a very stable phenomena. But our research shows that, well, it's not that stable. It's actually possible to change levels of corruption. It varies between countries, within countries, but also over time. And I think changing nature of corruption in EU member states is very, very interesting. And I also think that this variation in the proportion of women elected is very interesting. And what I want to find out in the ongoing project is, well, what is the effect on women citizens on the ground? So far, I have been mostly showing kind of, how to say, overarching effects we have not reached. So what's happening on the ground? What's happening in everyday life? What's happened with women's self-determination? So I want to study effects of corruption on self-determination for women in everyday life in European countries. And the main indicator I'm working with is not the only indicator, but it's female participation in the paid labor force. And in this project, I use a measure from Varieties of Democracy Institute, and I'm focusing on executive corruption. And that is how routinely members of the executive and public sector employees grant favors in exchange for bribes, etc. And in this project, I'm mainly focused on the national level. So now we move to the national level. And here is a comparison of 2000 and 2015, where I categorize countries. Either they have a low level of women in parliament, medium level, or a high level of women in parliament. And either they have high levels of executive corruption, medium level, or a low level of executive corruption. And I have in red here the main cells that you are supposed to focus on. And what we can see is that Hungary and Greece, both in 2000 and 2015, are in the cell, the worst cell, so to speak, with low proportion of women in parliament, high level of executive corruption. And on the other end, in year 2000, we find Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden in the best cell, with a high number of women in the national parliament and low level of corruption. But what I think is interesting is that, well, there are movements towards a better situation. So Slovakia and Latvia, in 15 years, they have left the worst cell, and a number of countries have gotten into the best cell. So there are movements, there are dynamics taking place, and I think that this is very, very interesting. And then just one final slide here. So when I look at female labor force participation, and here are the countries with high corruption, low proportion of women elected. Well, on average, female labor force participation is much lower than in the other cells. And it's highest in those countries where the proportion of women is high and corruption levels are low. So these are dynamics affecting our lives, how we live, and why this is the case, I still try to figure out in my book that I'm trying to wrap out, but it's hard. So the letters and figures and everything is still up in the air, but it has a working title. It's called Gender Sensitive State Power: Why Corruption Hinders Women's Self-Determination. And the idea that I have here is that, well, there's a need for a high number of women elected to local councils, to national parliament, because that affects the will of the state. With higher numbers of women elected, the state will push harder for gender equality in everyday life. But the level of corruption is also important to take into account, because we have seen that corruption is an obstacle for gender equality. It's an obstacle for the election of women, and therefore it affects the will of the state. But it's also an obstacle because it means leakages of public resources that could have been used to strengthen the position of women in everyday life. So what I'm trying to sell in this book, that these are two twin dimensions of the state that we need to take into account if we want to understand why there is so much variation in gender equality in everyday life in EU today. And also if we want to understand why is it the case that there's progress in certain places. Well, it's because these two factors go together and have an impact on how we live as women and men in society today. Okay?
Thank you so much.
That was a lot.
That's super interesting. Thank you. We open up the floor for Q&A. Please raise your hands. Stefan, you can. Okay, you need. Can you please, when you say your question, say your name and your research
And please
field.
talk loud, because I
Keep up the hands, the rest of you, so I can.
have a bit of a bad hearing.
Stefan Svalfors, I'm a sociologist. Thank you very much for this. It was really, really interesting. I have two kind of, I guess, conceptual questions. And the first is, when you outlined the various explanations for these macro correlations, I think they partly related to two different aspects. One is whether the politician in question are themselves engaged in corrupt practices, and the other one is like, to what extent are they engaged in regulating the behaviors of others? And these are not necessarily the same thing, but and could you please say something about that? And the second question is, you made this distinction between petty and grand corruption, but they are similar in the way that they are kind of relating to kind of simple tit-for-tat things. I give you 100 kronor and you offer me a service. You give me a $10 million bribe and I will guarantee that you will get this thing. But there is a third or different kind of corruption that has been labeled like sophisticated or subtle corruption, that does not include these kind of simple tit-for-tat things, but include favoritism, nepotism. I mean, to take a purely hypothetical example, when the prime minister in a country employs his buddy for a key national security position, that doesn't involve any kind of bribes and so on, but it is a corrupt behavior nevertheless. And are there any data of the kind that you have presented here on that aspect, and what can be said about gender differences in that regard? I was opponent at a PhD dissertation some time ago that used Swedish register data to great effect to capture this sophisticated corruption. And one interesting thing was that he didn't find any difference in whether, the person in the hiring organization was the mother or the father, or the person applying for the job was the son or the daughter. He didn't actually report that in the thing because it was a non-find, but to me that was quite interesting.
No, thank you very much. As you said, the different explanations focus on different things. So risk aversion and also the outsider focus on behavior of politicians themselves. I totally agree. Whether what we are trying to focus on is more indirect effects that is running through civil servants. And this is the reason why I don't think that they are competing explanations, but more of complementing each other. And why we are focusing on this issue area specialization is because before we started our research, it was not in the research field. So then the research focused on women as outsiders or as more risk-averse than men. But they do not make total sense, especially not the risk aversion perspective, because when levels of corruption are really, really high, it's really risky to not take part in corruption levels. So therefore we thought, well, this cannot be the only kind of explanation. And I was also building on my previous research that did not include corruption at all, but through studies on women, female politicians in Sweden over time, I have seen that female politicians are actually pushing for different policies than male politicians. And why should that not be the case in other countries? And more research have been done showing that female politicians, whether they like it or not, they push for other policies than male politicians. And why not see whether this can be part of the explanation? So yes, they are focusing on different things, and I think that they are complementary rather than competing. And as everyone understands, measuring corruption is tricky, because this is, of course, a shadowy thing. No one wants to admit that they are part of corruption. And can we actually believe respondents when they say that they have been paying a bribe or given an informal gift? And is this the most important measure of corruption? Because there are other ways of understanding misconduct if you use this broader concept. And as far as I have seen, various measures of corruption or misconduct, they tend to go together. So it does not really matter that much which kind of measure that we are using, but there can of course be differences here. So I think that the important thing is to try to use different measures and see whether the results are stable. I have not used any data on nepotism or favoritism myself. And the third question, if I understand it, is that, well, gender does not have an effect everywhere, every time. And this is true. And also female politicians are, of course, involved in corruption scandals. We do not expect anything else to happen. So this is not about, and I don't think that that is what you're asking for, it's not about every single female politician, but what's happening on average with when there's a high number of women elected, and especially if it increases. And I have myself been part of studies where we have compared what's happening on the electoral arena if we compare with the bureaucracy or with women in top level administrative posts on the national level. And the correlation is much stronger if we look at the electoral arena than when we compare to the bureaucracy or administrative posts. And why? Because there are different dynamics in the electoral arena. Here, politicians, they know that they will stand in an election, and therefore they have what they have done is more highlighted. And also it could be the case that female politicians, out of purely strategic reason, present themselves as clean alternatives, and if you have presented yourself as a clean alternative and misbehave, then you will be punished. So I think that the electoral arena is very different from other forms of arena, and we cannot expect this correlation to pop up everywhere. We have to think carefully. Why does it pop up, and what's happening, and what are the dynamics in this specific context?
Thank you. Felicia.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. My name is Felicia. I work right now on a project on labor rights in logistic industries. I was wondering if you could address a little bit more the kind of reasoning behind causation and correlation. I think you were going into it right at the very end as well. What I see is, like, I think, of course, a lot of what you presented makes sense, but also it's really interesting with this focus on education and healthcare, because if those but to kind of arenas work well, they're also essential for like freeing up women to actually become politicians. And if they work well, they also maybe they indicate that there are levels of corruption. So just as women politicians might influence these to work better, arenas to work better and be less corrupt, if they are less corrupt and work well, it will also maybe increase the number of female politicians. So I was wondering if this is something that you have thought about, or how you've been reasoning about this kind of back and forth a little bit.
In this book project, I try to reason about this kind of reinforcing mechanism. So if the number of women increases, the lowest levels of corruption, then it's easier for women to take part in politics, and then they will increase. So it's a kind of feedback mechanism. But it's very hard to get any good empirical evidence on this. So in this book project, I try to sell it as I'm building a theory. I'm using the empirics that I have in order to build a theory, but I cannot prove every single part of the causal chain. And well, if I cannot prove every single part, should I then try to write a book, or should I wait? If I wait, there will never be a book. But I have tried to make interviews with female politicians in more corrupt countries than Sweden. But it's kind of hard to get at the evidence for this. But what I'm suggesting is, I think the way that you do. And this is why it is so interesting that we find a pattern in education and healthcare, but not in police authorities. And I think that strengthens the argument that it's something true going on here.
Patricia.
So thank you very much for the... Is it on? Yeah. So thank you very much for the interesting talk. My name is Patricia Mendes from philosophy. I have two questions. One concerns the reversed causality. And you excluded that, right? But I was a little bit unclear about why were the reasons why that was excluded as a hypothesis. And I suppose that one of the reasons why I'm asking that is also that what you get at towards the end of the role of women in labor could be speaking towards that idea that, of course, if women are less likely to work, they are also less likely to get elected, and this might hang together with the situation in which there is corruption. So something about why you excluded that hypothesis. And second question is, you didn't mention culture, but I suppose that there are cultural dimensions to how corruption works, and perhaps a comment on that and how that could play into this.
And the last question was the
role of culture, perhaps.
Yeah. No. Well, I excluded this in this talk because I had to make a choice. I could not focus on everything. But I think about this as both an obstacle for getting women elected, but also when women get elected, they are linked to reduced levels of corruption. And I have done a study on Mexico where we had the measure of corruption in 2001 at the regional level in Mexico, and then we had data for the proportion of women elected in 2005, and then we had data on levels of corruption from 2010, and then we could see that where corruption was high in 2001, the number of women elected in 2005 was lower than in other places, but we can also see where the proportion of women was high in 2005, it also meant a lower level of corruption in 2010. And what was good with that data was that we could control for the level of corruption in 2001 and see that there was actually a reduction in 2010. So this kind of complicated data, but it actually showed that yes, when there is corruption, it functions as an obstacle for women to get elected, but also at the other end, when the proportion of women increases, it reduces levels of corruption under control for previous levels of corruption. So that this is a study that I did together with my colleague Marsha Grimes. And yes, corruption is a cultural thing, of course, and also the form of the corruption takes in a certain country is also a cultural thing. So when I presented my research in Italy, for example, they tend to get a bit upset. But when they can see that I also include informal gifts, they say, well, yes, yeah, aha, that's true. But not kind of, you do not give money in a small envelope in Italy to receive certain kind of services, but informal gifts, well, yes. But culture matters, but that does not mean that countries never increase in levels of corruption. A lot of data from Transparency International is saying that levels of corruption are increasing in Sweden. And what I show here is that corruption is much more unstable than we tend to think. So it varies on the subnational level, but there is also variation within regions over time. And I would say that this speaks against corruption as being very much a cultural thing. It's partly a cultural thing, but not only, because there are other dynamics taking place.
Andreas.
Okay, Andreas Duit, political science. Thank you very much for this. This was a lot of very interesting and fascinating stuff. I have, I guess, 3 questions, and the first one kind of feeds into the 2 others. So I'll start with that one, and that is, I mean, you've done a very thorough job in trying to disentangle the causal paths here, and I mean, I am kind of convinced, but I still have lingering doubts about whether you've really shown that women's representation and levels of corruption are not just both caused by some underlying common factors, such as, you know, modernization or a more professional public administration or something like that. That is manifest in both more representation for women, but also a more well-functioning public administration. So what do you say to that? Is that a valid claim, or do you think that you've shown that there is no such common underlying factor? And then my second question has to do with your mechanisms here, and maybe I've misunderstood it, but I kept thinking, well, you know, with the first one about women having interest in certain areas that are more important to women, but men probably don't like having to pay bribe for healthcare and education either. You know, it's not like they don't care about it. They would probably also feel that this is something that I would rather get rid of than you know, just accept. So I'm wondering to what extent your findings there really speak in favor of your mechanism, because it implies that women have stronger incentives for this. And then finally, the signaling that you ended with, the argument there, I'm wondering, well, I mean, don't all politicians always signal to the bureaucracy that you're not allowed to take bribes, stop doing that, that's naughty, and then they still do it. So I'm wondering, you know, why is it different if a female representative comes into power and says, stop doing that, you're not allowed? Why would they stop doing it then, but not when someone else told them to do that? So
No, I understand. Well, if you look at the publications themselves, and not only to my presentation, you will see that we include all kinds of controls, GDP per capita in the region, the kind of measures we try to have on local gender, culture, etc. And in my book project that I'm trying to do, I also have controls for GDP per capita and things that try to capture these kind of underlying things. And when it comes to female labor force participation, GDP per capita is very much affecting, of course. But the kind of interactions that I'm studying are still significant. So it's not the case that other factors are not important, but my favorite explanations are also important, even under control for these underlying factors. So we try to, I mean, I'm not the person doing all these empirical studies, but I trust my colleagues because they are very skilled, and they're very skilled at finding all kinds of controls and doing all kinds of robustness checks. And I think it's also important to remember that I'm not talking about all women, all men, all male politicians, all female politicians, but the kind of averages. And there we can see that, well, on average, female politicians is pushing for certain policy agenda. So on average, they are lowering the level of corruption, which does not mean that men are never lowering level of corruption or are not interested in those areas. So it's we need to keep this in mind. And also, most of our results go in the same direction among male and female respondents. It's just the case that the effect is much stronger among women citizens than among men citizens. And yeah, I've been giving talks to top-level bureaucrats from highly corrupt countries, and when I try to make a joke with them and ask them, so what is your favorite explanation for this? Well, they are kind of feeling a bit uncomfortable, but then they say that it's true, women are harsher. And it's also a finding showing that women are put on positions protecting the money in an organization because they're believed to be harsher. And whether they are or not, I think there is some truth here that at least civil servants, what we think is that they believe that women are harsher on these topics. So yes, we build on other research showing that civil servants, they tend to adapt to anyone in power. But what we are arguing is that, well, they adapt in a different way. If there's an increase in the number of women elected, and especially if the increase is large, then what we guess is that this is noted in media, and civil servants also note if there is a large increase, not if there's an increase in 0.5%, but if 5 percentage points or more, well, then it gets noted, and then it sends a signal. But we cannot prove this, but this is our best guess so far.
Stina, du kan köra här kanske. Yeah. Okay. It's so weird with this one because you have to. Okay, so yeah, I had a question about if your explanations for this, for the fact that more women tend to less corruption, if you think that that's kind of applies, like if the increase, like if there's more and more women, like regardless of how many there are, so to say. So I would think that from the examples that you have, the least corrupt countries with the most amount of women are countries where it's roughly 50% of politicians are women, right? Mm. But would you then think that it's kind of, if it would be even more women, so if we would have if there would be 80 or 90% of women politicians, would that continue to decrease corruption in a society? Or is there kind of a limit to to the increase of women? Mm. So is the I guess the question is kind of if it's just the amount of women per se that's the important thing, or if it's something about equality or something in among politicians. Mm. So yeah, if you could speculate something about that.
Good question. No, so a high number of women elected is not a safeguard for corruption. And if we believe the data from Transparency International, there's an increase in corruption levels in Sweden. And Sweden has had a high number of women elected for decades. So having a high number of women elected does not mean that the corruption levels will always stay low. I don't think so, because there's so many other things happening in society, and this is not the only explanation for variation in levels of corruption. And we need to think carefully about what's happening in society. And like in Sweden, we know that the welfare system has changed since the 1990s and become much more fragmented. And I think that this is, I'm not an expert on corruption in Sweden, but if I think a bit more freely here, I think that this fragmentation has meant an increased corruption risk. And there is indication that this is the case. So this is happening not totally isolated, but in another, how to say, silo than the increase in the number of women elected. And this is one reason why I think that we need to always study both the number of women elected and levels of corruption in society and dynamics taking place if we want to understand gender equality on the ground. So how does this affect women's self-determination in everyday life? Because the story is not only about female politicians, but it's also about corruption levels and other things going on, like economic developments and so on. So now what happens if the number of women, if women become the privilege and not men? I don't know. We can only speculate. And perhaps then the pressure on female politicians to represent certain kinds of policies will diminish, and therefore they will not be incentivized to push for a state on track in the same way. So, no, my message is not that high numbers of women in politics will always mean low levels of corruption.
Då tar vi frågor online. Bosse.
Hej, hör ni mig?
Ja då, jag hör dig.
Hej Lena.
Bosse, kan du prata lite högre?
Jag ska se om jag kan skruva upp detta lite grann. Hör jag nu? Hallå?
Yeah, I don't know if we can raise a little bit the volume.
Kan jag höras nu?
Yeah, yes, good.
Okej, jag hittade knappen på mina hörlurar. Härligt att höra dig Lena, vilken fin presentation. Bara en liten, Lena och jag har ju pratat om detta i många år. Om jag börjar tänka på om det inte kan finnas en kausal mekanism som inte är på individnivå utan som är på mer...
Bosse, you have to ask in English.
Okay, sorry. Sorry. Okay, I was thinking if there couldn't be a causal mechanism that is not so centered on individual perceptions, but on a more at a more aggregate level. So during historical time, and also if you look around in the world today, most people would think of the public sector and the state as an operation for the interest of a political and economic elite. This is, 70% of the world's population living in pretty corrupt states. Alina Mungupipidi has launched the idea that the change is about the sort of default thinking of what the state is, from this an operation for the elite to some kind of ethical universalism. That sort of, it's a kind of common good thing. Now, this, of course, relies on an idea, I think, about equal treatment of citizens, impartiality. That is what the state in this ethical universalism should be about. Now, most societies, and maybe some people think it's still the case today, have, of course, discriminated against women forever. But if there is a state or a public sector say this is no longer okay, women, we will not reach gender equality in a while, but at least in the public sector, men and women should be treated equally, according to this norm of impartiality. Now, there are 100 definitions of gender equality, but one of them that I like is about impartiality, that it shouldn't matter if you're a woman or a man, if you apply for a position or something. Could it be that states or regional entities that sort of adhere to this ethical universally sends a signal about impartiality? That is important. And that is connected to gender equality, that this is what the state is about. It's not about sort of just benefiting a male economic and political elite. It's an ethical operation based on impartiality. And this is what sort of creates this connection between gender equality and low levels of corruption.
No, well, I don't think that I'm arguing against it. No, of course, it's an important signal if you are treated impartial by public servants. But I don't think that this perhaps is enough in order to have this kind of progressive developments. And I also think that this is in line with what you're arguing in your books, is that citizens need some kind of proof in order to trust the government, and the kind of proofs that women need, I think, are different than what men need. And I think that in order for women to trust the state, it's not enough that they are treated impartially by public servants, but they also need to see that the state is taking care of their possibilities to have self-determination. And what do women need in order to have self-determination compared to men? They need some kind of public services to be able to work and have a family, and that is public child care, elder care, etc. It does not have to be public, but they need to see that the state is engaging in their specific obstacles that they meet. And we know that women meet different obstacles than men. So therefore I don't think that there is enough with the impartiality in the meeting between citizens and civil servants in order for progressive development to take place. For women to support the state and have trust in the state, etc., they also need to see that the state is delivering in the areas that affect their lives more than they affect the husbands. Because you know this, that more men than women are in the paid labor force, and more women than men have caretaking responsibilities in everyday life. So, well, impartial treatment by civil servants is important, but it's not the only factor. Yeah, if I was answering your question.
Yeah, good. Good enough.
So before we end, I just want to announce the next seminar, research seminar is the 19th of March with Patricia, together with Rebecca Stern. We're going to talk about juridical time and the role of migration in the role of migration law. And the week after that, the 26th, we have Kristina Garsten, who is principal of SCAS, Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies, and the topic is not settled yet. So that's the next one. Thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you.